Before Ilia Malinin even twitched, a strange disconnect hung in the air, a phantom of unresponsiveness, faint and nearly invisible. Seasoned observers of the rink develop a sixth sense for when the very energy of the room begins to shift. It wasn't a failure but a lack of psychological settling. The lens lingered on his face far longer than the script dictated. This minor beat went unnoticed by the masses, yet it shattered the routine's internal clockwork. Even the announcers slowed their pace. A commentator faltered, swallowing a thought that almost escaped his lips. Meanwhile, the thousands in the stands sat in uncharacteristic silence. That hollow quiet is what truly lingers. At an event like the 2026 World Championships, the atmosphere is usually predictable. Typically, the mere mention of a powerhouse like Ilia Malinin triggers an explosive wave of adrenaline throughout the entire building. Expectation normally ignites into a roar the second he is announced. This time, the spark failed to catch, leaving a beat of empty space. Such a stutter in the world's heartbeat suggests a hidden gear is grinding out of place. Not in a way you can see. It wasn't a flaw you could point to, only a sense of wrongness. From a distance, one might argue these ripples were irrelevant. After all, the most formidable figure on the planet was stepping into the spotlight at the most prestigious gala outside of the Olympics. The script was set. He arrives, he conquers, and he reinforces the legend everyone has already come to accept. That was the plan, but as he stood motionless awaiting the opening chords, the image of the invincible champion began to blur. His form was perfect, his posture firm, yet he lacked the expected urgency. He seemed strangely, almost dangerously, detached from the moment. This marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Usually, when a competitor hits the peak of their career, the pressure turns nerves into steel. Every movement becomes surgical and calculated. You can usually see the mental effort required to anchor the soul before the music begins. Instead of focused tension, there was a void. Gone was the desperate need to dominate, the coiled spring of anxiety, or the heavy burden of having to validate his own legendary status. Anyone who has studied greatness knows that this kind of hollow calm is anything but normal for a man in his position. A silent inquiry began to circulate through the arena, a question no one dared to whisper but everyone felt. What actually happens to an athlete when they stop treating the pinnacle of their career like it truly matters? The answer to that mystery took root before the first violin sounded, long before his blades cut the ice, and well ahead of the final numbers. Most analysts looking back at the events in Prague will focus on the technical execution, the rotation of the jumps, and the scores. That is the obvious narrative. However, tracing that line leaves out the true origin of this shift, which didn't actually start in Prague. It certainly wasn't born during those few minutes. The seeds were planted earlier, in a moment that seemed trivial. After his Olympic run, his reflections were surprisingly devoid of technical jargon. He didn't obsess over the physics of his rotation or the specific mechanics of his edge control. He offered a far simpler truth. His own mind had become a chaotic storm of distractions that he simply could not outrun. Pause and consider the weight of that admission from the most sophisticated technician the skating world has ever seen. A man capable of spinning in mid-air at a velocity that defies the human eye's ability to even track his silhouette. He spent a lifetime mastering every millisecond of physical movement, only for his inner world to crumble when the spotlight was at its brightest. A crack in the psyche like that doesn't just vanish, it stays with a person. It manifests in the subtle ways an athlete greets the next challenge. It lives in the stillness before the bell, the choice to micromanage or let go. This was why the air in Prague felt fundamentally altered. By the time he reached the 2026 World Championships, the heavy burden of public hope had only grown more intense. The stakes had shifted from whether he could simply win to whether he could finally reset his own mind. It was the crushing demand of a reset, not the climb to the top, but the exhausting task of proving that his spirit remained unchanged. Yet, Malinin refused to play that game. There was zero effort to scrub away the stains of the past or frantically repair the damage from the previous seasons. He wasn't trying to reconstruct the idol the public craved. Instead, it felt as though a vital piece of his armor had been discarded. It wasn't a loss of faith, but a shedding of skin. When that happens, the resulting display doesn't need to be louder to be profound. The change isn't found in the height of the leap, but in the silence preceding the takeoff. Not too long ago, watching Ilia Malinin had become a foregone conclusion, losing that edge of wild uncertainty that defines true greatness. Every competition followed the same rigid blueprint. The routine was flawless, landing quad after quad with such clinical ease it almost felt like a machine at work. He executed sequences that seemed to exist in a completely different dimension from his rivals on the rink. Eventually, a subtle transformation took root. It wasn't within him, but rather in the audience's soul, which initially reacted with volcanic intensity. Every landed rotation sparked a massive surge of thunderous noise, electric excitement, and pure, unadulterated shock. Such is the honeymoon phase of innovation in sport. Yet, as the miracle becomes routine, the collective heartbeat begins to settle. The spectators no longer grip their seats with the same desperation. The announcers' voices stop reaching those frantic, high-pitched peaks. Even the quiet beats between maneuvers lose their edge. When consistency reigns, the raw suspense that keeps us breathing simply evaporates. Uncertainty is the fuel for fascination. Consider that specific showdown in late 2022 at the Grand Prix final in Turin. A frigid arena and a packed house set a standard scene. However, midway through his routine, something truly peculiar unfolded. Perfection was on display. Every maneuver was flawless, devoid of any visible struggle or hesitation, leaving no room for a potential disaster. Paradoxically, that flawlessness was the issue. Without the haunting threat of failure, the performance loses its magnetic, heart-pounding grip. You quit wondering if he will stick the landing and simply wait for the inevitable. That shift alters the entire experience. The viewer is no longer witnessing a live, unfolding drama. They are merely watching a predetermined outcome verify itself. This creates a heavy, unique burden for the athlete. It isn't the hunger of the climb, but the weight of the peak. Now, every time his blades touch the frozen surface, he is no longer just presenting a choreographed story. He carries a destiny that the world has already written. He is no longer being measured against the other skaters. He is fighting the ghost of his own perfection. And perfection is a cage that offers no sanctuary for human error. It forbids any deviation. It demands absolute stillness in the face of brilliant, unchanging execution. While the exterior remains polished, a silent pressure begins to crystallize within not a looming collapse, but a subtle erosion surfacing much later. When the cracks finally appear, they are rarely spectacular. They manifest as a faint, unsettling dissonance in his natural rhythm. Reflecting on the events before Prague, that rot likely didn't begin there. It had probably been festering for many months. When the world looked at Prague and proclaimed a comeback, it seemed logical. On a superficial level, everything was restored. His rotations were surgical. His mastery was undeniable. Even without chasing the impossible, his delivery felt incredibly sharp and professional. From a purely technical standpoint, he delivered exactly what is expected of a world-class champion, perhaps even surpassing himself. Consequently, the media pounced. Descriptions of him being flawless and back on track flooded the airwaves almost instantly. Experts dissected the point tallies, while the followers obsessively measured this outing against his legendary past performances. Some claimed this was his most formidable form yet, exceeding his pre-Olympic peak. That might be true, but something else changed. Not exactly. If one ignores the technical acrobatics for a moment, the routine tells a different story than a simple return. The desperation was gone. He didn't look like a man clawing back a vanished glory or fighting to reclaim his throne. There was a strange airiness to it. Usually, a comeback is defined by a heavy, visible grit and a fierce, burning intent. One can usually witness the strain and the mental wrestling required to force chaos back into a state of order. Most athletes use these moments to send a message. However, his skating lacked that defensive, proving ground energy. He wasn't hunting for a score. It never felt as though he needed the judge's approval to confirm his own worth. That missing ego altered the entire vibe. A tiny blink-and-you-miss-it moment occurred during the routine that revealed everything. A single movement lacked total polish, not a major error, and certainly nothing that would dent the technical tally. It was too minor for the announcers to notice, but rather than panicking, he let it breathe. He just kept flowing. Such subtle choices reveal more than a perfect quad ever could. At his level, control usually implies a rigid, desperate grip, but his demeanor suggested a new evolution. It was the look of a man who no longer felt the need. In that space, the skating transcends mere mechanics. It enters a realm of expression that escapes the logic of a scorecard. It is an ethereal quality that numbers cannot capture, leaving the standard analysis feeling hollow and strangely beside the point. Observers are busy chronicling the visuals, yet they are missing the fundamental shift in the skater's very essence. This is the crux. If Prague wasn't about returning to his former self, who is this new figure emerging now? When viewed through a wider lens, this event stops looking like a solitary outlier and resembles a much larger pattern. A transformation is rippling through the entire discipline. This wasn't an accident. The context of the current era is vital. Following the latest Olympic Games, the fundamental philosophy of the sport has begun to pivot in very invisible ways. Elite stars are walking away from the limelight far sooner than anyone could have ever predicted. Peers finally shattered the silence surrounding the psychological grind and exhaustion that once remained hidden behind the rink's curtain. No grand fanfare preceded it, yet a tectonic shift felt undeniable the moment Ilia Malinin touched the ice in Prague. There was no loud manifesto, only a quiet, unsettling stillness that spoke louder than any shout. He stepped into the spotlight with a completely transformed spirit. From the stands, an observer might have seen the same old routine. The jumps landed, the scoreboard climbed, and the lead was secured. Those facts are objective, yet a deeper alchemy was at work. When a competitor of this caliber alters their internal frequency, even by a fraction, it doesn't just impact one night, it begins to rewrite the very DNA of their future career. Sometimes, that evolution isn't found in what is added, but in the heavy baggage that is finally discarded. The crushing need to validate every whisper of expectation had evaporated, leaving no visible trace of the burden behind. The change lived in the spaces between movements, like an opening sequence where he refused to be rushed by the clock. He clung to a singular edge, just a heartbeat longer than necessary. A subtle rebellion that threw the entire rhythm into a new dimension. Tempo in this arena is a truth teller. When a skater is desperate to win, their every motion tends to constrict and tighten. They become a portrait of rigid precision. But when the ghost of the chase is gone, the performance finally begins to breathe. Subtle, yet hauntingly clear. If that transformation is real, then Prague wasn't a simple comeback story. It was something far more cryptic and potentially world-altering. It was a psychological pivot. If this new mindset takes root, it won't just change his scores. It shifts the very ground beneath his rivals' feet. In Prague, the traditional narrative didn't survive the first note of music. The question was never about technical delivery. That part of the enigma had already been solved through sheer athleticism. The judges confirmed the numbers, and the top of the leaderboard became his familiar territory once again. But to stop there is to miss the haunting beauty of the moment. This performance didn't end a chapter, it ignited a new fire. You could hear the hesitation in the post-skate analysis. The words were shaky and indirect. Observers circled an idea they couldn't quite grasp, calling him calmer or unbound without ever touching the truth. They swore he looked different, but those surface-level descriptions failed to capture the magnetic pull of his presence. Perhaps the old metrics are useless now. Typically, we box these stories into redemptions, course corrections, or simple displays of power. This performance refused those labels. A standard comeback would have been marked by a frantic, visible hunger. A mere correction would have radiated a sense of forced, hyper-aware control. Raw dominance usually feels like a clenched fist, yet he moved with a strange, liquid ease. The most striking detail was the absence of struggle. No chase, no reclamation of lost pride, no frantic mending of a broken image. That void invited a much more profound and lingering question. It wasn't about his return to form, but what happens when a champion no longer needs the validation of form? He is playing a new game. This version of the athlete seems entirely uninterested in the exhausting act of proving himself. He is immune to the usual pressures and ignores the traditional path, making his next move a mystery with two possible fates. The first path is comfortable. Everything proceeds exactly as the world expects it to. The routines stay flawless, the marks remain high, and the old story settles back into its familiar groove. Prague becomes just another data point. But there is a second, more shadowed possibility. The internal shift we felt might not be a passing phase, but a quiet deepening of his very soul. If that is the case, the real difference won't be found in the cold light of the judges' scores. It will appear in how the moments bend to his will and how opponents struggle to fight a ghost they cannot see. The real enigma isn't what occurred on the ice in Prague. It's which version of the man just revealed himself, and if this new version remains.